deep in the reads, and today I am reviewing the book that I promised in my last video, which is a high fantasy novel set in the magical world of Middle-earth. That book is, of course, The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Eddison. E.R. Eddison was an English civil servant, but he had an intense passion for Scandinavian folklore, ancient mythology, and ancient languages. He even translated a few Icelandic sagas in his own time. He was part of the same literary society as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and he published a book set in Middle-earth, his first high fantasy novel, 15 years before Tolkien did. And you might be wondering how similar the books are, considering they're both taken from the same Scandinavian folklore, and they are very, very distinct from each other. Unlike Tolkien, E.R. Eddison avoids the typical good versus evil tropes, and he goes for a more complicated and nuanced, power struggle dynamic. And although the book has a very romanticized surface level, where it's all about, bravado and bluster and martial virtues and manliness, there's a streak of irony running through this whole book that, if you're reading between the lines, makes it quite an interesting deconstruction, considering it's a novel that was written 100 years ago. The book starts off with what is probably the weirdest framing device I have ever read, and I've heard of people being put off by the randomness of it, but don't worry, the character who serves as the framing device in the beginning completely disappears within a few pages, so it's just best to go with the flow until he leaves the scene and the real characters take the stage. The main characters are the four kings of Demonland, who have been antagonized by the ruler of Witchland. Tensions start to build, and this guy named Lord Grow sort of sees the situation, and he wants to ensure the war, so he manipulates things from behind the scenes to ensure that war does happen. Tensions spill over, and the fragile peace is shattered, an ancient evil is summoned, and the two kingdoms go to war with each other, and it's made all the more complicated by the fact that they have people that are intermarried. They have relatives on either side, and E.R. Edison's rendering of Middle-earth has a deep history to it, which informs the actions of the characters in the warring states. To make it even more complicated, there is the fact that a retrieval story springs up, and the main characters are forced to go on a long and perilous journey into parts unknown, all while the second characters are waging war back home. But in the end, a story about two warring states and a long journey is not particularly unique for a fantasy novel. What makes this novel stand out is the way that it's told and the themes that underpin it. For example, like I said, there's that tongue-in-cheek, ironic, sort of satirical take on fantasy. You've got the main characters and they're we are totally in the right, we're the good guys, we're the heroes, and then you've got side characters who are completely cynical of the whole thing, all that male chauvinism, all that egoism. The women are always sort of standing aside. They have a surprising amount of agency, they're making choices for themselves, they are shaping the story, and all the while they're looking at a lot of the male characters with one eyebrow raised. Lord Grow is also like that too. You learn about his history and you kind of come to understand why he's kind of this existentialist and a nihilist who doesn't buy into the vainglorious crap that everyone around him is constantly spouting. This is definitely a novel where the side characters are the most interesting. The main characters are comparatively simplistic. I would liken them to the gods and heroes of ancient tales like Homer's Odyssey. They usually have a single character trait, and the conflicts that come about in the story are caused or solved because of that trait. Pride, ego, and a constant jostling for power are recurring themes that the characters sort of symbolize, and the author likens the inevitability of war and the inexorable nature of conflict to the cycles of nature, like the cycles of the moon, the movements of the stars, the tides, the seasons, and astrological signs. All of this is used to sort of convey this idea that war is forever repeating itself. And of course, the symbol of the book, the worm Ouroboros, which is a serpent eating its own tail, is part of that theme as well. And the ending is a very subversive culmination of this cyclical war nature theme. It's very much a sort of satirical jab at fantasy up to that point in the genre, and in that way the War Ouroboros stands to me as sort of like a landmark between the romanticized fantasy of the past and the modern fantasy that would follow E.R. Eddison's work. So at this point you're probably wondering why the War Ouroboros has fallen into such relative obscurity and has been completely eclipsed by later writers like J.R.R. Tolkien. There's probably several reasons, but one of the most prominent that I can think of is definitely the prose. E.R. Eddison goes to great lengths to recreate Jacobean English in this book for the whole thing, and it's even more archaic when the characters pick up a letter or a book and start to read that, like it's like pseudo-Middle English. So I will read a passage and throw the text up on screen just to give you an idea of what the writing looks like on the page. So this is a letter. Renowned king and most high prince and lord, Gorus the 12th of Witchland and of Demonland, and of all the kingdoms the sun doth spread his beams over. Corsus your servant doth prostrate myself before your greatness, even before the face of the earth. The goddess grant unto you, the most noble lord, health and continence and safety many years. After that I had received my dispatch and leave from your majesty, whereby you did of your royal goodness give and grant unto me to be chief commander of all the warlike forces furnished and sent by you into Demonland, it may please your majesty, I did with haste carry mine army and all my weapons, munitions, victuals, and other provisions accordingly toward those parts of Demonland that lie coasted against the eastern seas. I have seen people on Goodreads saying that when it comes to the letters in this book, they are unable to understand a single word, and it's mostly because of the way that the words are spelled rather than the words that are actually being used. I personally found the War Ouroboros incredibly rewarding. I love a challenge, I love to extend my vocabulary, and this book was definitely good for that. So if you are planning any D&D campaigns, or if you like Ren fairs, this book will be good for building your antiquated vocabulary. I did have a few issues with the book here and there. The main one being that I found that a few of the plot threads, which we were led to believe would have a complicated or really dramatic payoff, ended up having pretty simple resolutions. They cut off a bit too cleanly for my liking. Although generally speaking, I did like the ending, despite the fact that it's quite controversial to a lot of the people that have read this. The other thing was I found Eddison used the Deus Ex Machina to get his characters out of tight situations a little bit too much. In that way he kind of reminded me of J.R.R. Tolkien. The other thing that reminded me of Tolkien is there's a pretty tedious section in this book where it's characters climbing a mountain. So characters moving from point A to point B, and it is boring as hell. Like, very pedantic in the descriptions, very cumbersome to read. You're very aware that you're like staring at words on a page, if you know what I mean. But also like Tolkien, there are moments of shimmering beauty with the way that he describes the landscapes. Moments like this made me really happy to have the patience to get into the language that was being used. It also encouraged me and sort of lit a spark in me to go back and read older English stories like Shakespeare and Milton, and I even tried a sort of modern translation of Sir Gawain's Green Knight. But yeah, going forward, I'm definitely interested in reading older sort of medieval English tales, especially like Arthurian legends and stuff like that. So that's definitely one benefit of reading a book like this. One of the unfortunate side effects, though, of having the War Ouroboros be so reminiscent of medieval and ancient fairy tales is that it has that sort of distant and muted feel that you often get from ancient classics. There are definitely passages and sections that leap out of the page at you, but overall it sort of lacks any quaintness or sentimentality or charm that you would expect from, let's say, The Hobbits or The Shire from Lord of the Rings. And so you don't quite have anything to grab onto sympathetically, although I understand that Eddison was very clearly trying to not be sentimental. He was using romanticism as a satirical trope. I still think that the book is very valuable to read and worth seeking out if you're a fantasy fan, especially if you're not really too familiar with anything that came pre-Tolkien. Like, Eddison is a guy who was writing fantasy for adults before C.S. Lewis, before J.R.R. Tolkien, before Michael Moorcock. And the book is 100 years old as of this year, so it's definitely worth picking up and reevaluating if you're into fantasy, or if you want to see how fantasy came to be, how it developed, and what it was like when it was still in gestation, before all of the tropes were like cemented in place and really tamped down. It's a very unique read, for sure. So now we come to the rating part of this review, and this is the part where I should admit that my opinion of this book fluctuates a lot, so let's just be optimistic for today and give it a light 7 out of 10. The book is a lot of fun. It's very interesting to see what the fantasy genre looked like while it was still forming. Although it's challenging to read at times, although it's a bit static at times, I thought it was quite an engaging story. Like I said, very valuable to go back and reassess the books that didn't make it into the Hall of Fame of your favorite genre. And since the book is 100 years old, there's no better time to do it than now, so what are you waiting for? Find a copy. Anyway, that's my review. I'm out, so thank you for watching. I have no idea when I'll be back.